Welcome to Midnight and Murder, a true crime storytelling channel for sleeping. Let's get into our first story. Story 1. Samuel Little. In the quiet confines of a California prison cell, an elderly man with failing health began to tell stories. Not the kind of stories one might expect from a grandfather figure, but chilling confessions that would rewrite the history of serial murder in America. Samuel Little, a name that would become synonymous with unimaginable horror, was about to reveal the true scope of a killing spree that had lasted nearly 4 decades. Samuel McDowell Little was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, a small town where the summer heat seemed to press down on everything like a heavy hand. From his earliest years, Little's life was marked by instability and violence. His mother, Bessie Little, was a teenage single parent who struggled with her own demons, moving frequently and leaving young Samuel in the care of his grandmother for long stretches. The grandmother who raised him was a stern woman who ruled with an iron fist, but even her discipline couldn't contain the darkness that seemed to grow within the boy. By the time he was a teenager, Little had already displayed the warning signs that criminologists would later recognize as predictors of violent behavior: cruelty to animals, persistent lying, and an unsettling fascination with death. Little's criminal career began early and violently. His first arrest came at age 16 for burglary, but it was the pattern of violence against women that truly defined his path. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, he accumulated arrests for rape, assault, and armed robbery across multiple states. The justice system of that era seemed incapable of recognizing the true danger he represented, often releasing him after relatively short sentences or allowing him to plead down to lesser charges. What law enforcement didn't understand at the time was that these arrests represented only the tip of an iceberg. For every crime that resulted in an arrest, Little was committing dozens more that went undetected. He had developed a methodology that was as simple as it was horrifying. He targeted vulnerable women, often those involved in sex work or struggling with addiction, strangling them with his massive hands and leaving their bodies in remote locations where they might never be found. Little's killing spree truly began in earnest in 1970, when he was 30 years old. His first confirmed victim was Mary Jo Brosley, a young woman whose body was found in a ditch outside Omaha, Nebraska. The local sheriff's department treated it as an isolated incident, never suspecting that they were looking at the work of someone who would become America's most prolific serial killer. The 1970s and 1980s were Little's most active years. He moved constantly across the country, never staying in one place long enough to establish a pattern that might alert law enforcement. His victims were chosen with calculated precision, women who lived on society's margins, whose disappearances might not trigger intensive investigations. He understood, with a predator's instinct, exactly which victims would be mourned and which would be forgotten. In Florida, he killed Patricia Mount, a young mother who had been struggling to make ends meet. Her body was found in a grove of orange trees, the cause of death listed as strangulation. The case went nowhere. In Georgia, he murdered Clara Birdlong, an elderly woman walking home from church. Again, the investigation stalled. In Texas, California, Ohio, Louisiana, the pattern repeated itself with terrifying consistency. What made Little particularly dangerous was his intelligence and his understanding of police procedure. He knew that law enforcement agencies in different jurisdictions rarely communicated effectively with each other, especially when it came to crimes involving marginalized victims. He could kill in one state and be hundreds of miles away before the body was even discovered, confident that no one would connect him to the crime. Little's method was brutally efficient. He would approach women under the pretense of offering them money for sex or drugs, then drive them to secluded areas where he would strangle them with his bare hands. He later told investigators that he found the act of killing intensely satisfying, describing in disturbing detail the physical sensations he experienced as his victims died. But perhaps what was most chilling about Little's confessions was his memory for detail. Decades after committing murders, he could recall specific features of his victims, what they were wearing, what they said in their final moments. He had an artist's eye for detail and would later create dozens of colored pencil drawings of his victims that were so accurate they helped investigators identify remains that had gone unidentified for years. The breakthrough in the Samuel Little case came not through brilliant detective work or advanced forensic science, but through the persistence of a single investigator who refused to give up on a cold case. Detective Rick Jackson of the Los Angeles Police Department had been working cold cases for years when he encountered the file of a woman named Guadalupe Apodaca, who had been found murdered in 1996. The case had all the hallmarks of Little's work: a vulnerable victim, death by strangulation, and a crime scene that yielded little physical evidence. But Jackson noticed something that previous investigators had missed: DNA evidence that had been collected but never properly analyzed due to the technological limitations of the time. When the DNA was finally processed in 2012, it came back with a match to Samuel Little, who was already in prison in California serving time for drug charges. The match was perfect, linking Little conclusively to the Apodaca murder and opening the door to what would become one of the most extensive cold case investigations in American history. Detective Jackson began reaching out to his counterparts across the country, sharing Little's DNA profile and asking them to review their own cold cases involving murdered women. The response was overwhelming. Within months, Little had been linked to additional murders in multiple states, and investigators began to realize they were dealing with a serial killer of unprecedented scale. In 2014, Little was convicted of 3 murders in Los Angeles and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At age 74, facing the rest of his life behind bars, Little made a decision that would shock the law enforcement community. He decided to confess. But Little's confessions weren't motivated by remorse or a desire for redemption. Instead, he seemed to view them as a final opportunity to relive his crimes and to claim credit for murders that had gone unsolved for decades. He spoke with investigators for hundreds of hours, providing detailed accounts of killings that spanned from 1970 to 2005. The scope of Little's confessions was staggering. He claimed to have killed 93 people, making him by far the most prolific serial killer in American history. The FBI, working with local law enforcement agencies across the country, began the massive task of verifying his claims. What they found was that Little's memory was remarkably accurate. Time and again, details from his confessions matched evidence from unsolved cases. He could describe crime scenes with photographic precision, recall conversations with victims, and provide information that only the killer could have known. The investigation into Little's crimes became a massive undertaking involving dozens of law enforcement agencies. The FBI created a dedicated website where they posted Little's drawings of his victims, hoping that family members or friends might recognize them and come forward. The response was immediate and heartbreaking, as families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their loved ones finally got answers. Among the confirmed victims was Denise Christie brothers, who had disappeared from Odessa, Texas in 1994. Her family had never stopped looking for her, never stopped hoping she might return home. Little's confession and the subsequent discovery of her remains brought them the closure they had sought for over 20 years, but also the devastating confirmation that she had died in the most horrible way imaginable. There was Mary Jo Payton, found dead in Miami in 1971, whose case had been closed as a drug overdose until Little's confession revealed she had actually been strangled. There was Anna Evans, killed in Kentucky in 1975, whose murder had remained unsolved until Little provided details that only her killer could have known. Each confession brought with it a flood of emotions for the families involved. Some expressed gratitude for finally knowing the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. Others struggled with anger and grief that had been reopened after years of trying to heal. All of them had to confront the reality that their family member had died at the hands of a man who killed for pleasure and showed no remorse for his actions. The FBI's investigation revealed that Little had been extraordinarily mobile throughout his killing career. He had no permanent address for much of his adult life, moving from city to city in stolen cars or by hitchhiking. This nomadic lifestyle had made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to track him, as he could commit a murder in one jurisdiction and be hundreds of miles away before an investigation even began. Little's victims came from all walks of life, though they were predominantly women of color from low-income communities. This demographic targeting was strategic. Little understood that crimes against these women were less likely to receive intensive investigation or media attention. He exploited societal inequalities and prejudices to avoid detection. knowing that the deaths of marginalized women were often treated as less important than those of victims from more privileged backgrounds. The geographic scope of Little's crimes was equally staggering. He had killed in at least 14 states, from California to Florida, from Texas to Ohio. Some investigators believe the actual number may be even higher, as Little traveled extensively throughout his criminal career and may have committed murders in states where his confessions haven't yet been verified. As news of Little's confessions spread, families across the country began reaching out to law enforcement, wondering if their missing loved ones might have been among his victims. The FBI received thousands of tips and inquiries, each representing someone's daughter, sister, mother, or friend who had vanished without explanation. The process of verifying Little's confessions was painstaking and emotionally draining for the investigators involved. They had to review decades-old case files, interview surviving witnesses, and in some cases search for remains in locations Little had described. Many of the original investigators had retired or died, leaving current detectives to piece together investigations that had grown cold years or even decades earlier. One of the most disturbing aspects of Little's case was his ability to compartmentalize his crimes. Between murders, he lived what appeared to be a relatively normal life. He had relationships with women who had no idea of his violent tendencies. He worked various jobs, from prizefighter to warehouse worker, and could present himself as charming and likable when it suited his purposes. This dual nature made Little particularly dangerous and difficult to catch. Unlike some serial killers who deteriorate mentally over time, Little maintained his composure and intelligence throughout his criminal career. He learned from his mistakes, adapted his methods, and became increasingly skilled at avoiding detection. The investigation also revealed the limitations of law enforcement practices in the 1970s and 1980s. Communication between jurisdictions was poor, forensic technology was primitive by today's standards, and there was little understanding of serial killer behavior patterns. Little exploited all of these weaknesses, staying one step ahead of investigators who were working with limited tools and knowledge. In December 2020, Samuel Little died in his prison cell at age 80. He had spent his final years in poor health, confined to a wheelchair and suffering from diabetes and heart disease. His death brought an end to one of the most prolific killing sprees in American history, but left many questions unanswered. At the time of his death, the FBI had confirmed Little as the killer in 60 cases, with strong evidence linking him to dozens more. The agency continues to investigate his remaining confessions, working to bring closure to families who have waited decades for answers about their missing loved ones. Little's case has had a profound impact on how law enforcement approaches serial crime investigation. It has highlighted the importance of communication between jurisdictions, the value of DNA technology in solving cold cases, and the need for investigators to pay attention to crimes against marginalized communities. The case has also sparked important conversations about victim advocacy and the resources devoted to investigating crimes against vulnerable populations. Many of Little's victims might still be alive today if their initial disappearances had received more attention or if patterns had been recognized earlier. Perhaps most importantly, Little's case serves as a reminder that evil can hide in plain sight for decades. He was able to kill with impunity for 35 years, not because he was particularly clever or sophisticated, but because the system failed to protect his victims and failed to recognize the patterns of his crimes. The families of Little's victims continue to seek justice and closure. Some have filed lawsuits against law enforcement agencies, claiming that inadequate investigations allowed Little to continue killing when he should have been stopped years earlier. Others have become advocates for missing persons cases, working to ensure that no other families have to endure what they have experienced. Samuel Little's legacy is one of unimaginable horror, but also of the importance of never giving up on cold cases, never forgetting the victims of violent crime, and never allowing society's most vulnerable members to be forgotten or ignored. His story serves as both a chronicle of evil and a testament to the persistence of those who seek justice, even when that justice comes decades too late. Story 2, The Kid Killer. The autumn wind carried an unusual chill through the quiet streets of Great Falls, Montana, in October 1996. Children walked home from school along the same routes they had taken for years, their backpacks bouncing with each step, unaware that a predator had been watching, waiting, and planning in their midst. Nathaniel Barjona seemed like an ordinary man to his neighbors. At 300 pounds with a gentle demeanor, he worked odd jobs around town and kept to himself in his small apartment on Central Avenue. But beneath this unremarkable exterior lurked one of the most disturbing criminal minds Montana had ever encountered. Barjona's story didn't begin in Montana. Born David Paul Brown in Massachusetts in 1957, his troubled childhood was marked by disturbing behavior that escalated as he grew older. By his teenage years, he had already begun what would become a lifelong pattern of targeting children. His first known offense occurred when he was just 17, attempting to strangle two young boys. This was merely the beginning of a dark journey that would span decades and cross state lines. After serving time in Massachusetts for multiple assaults on children, Barjona legally changed his name and moved west, seeking a fresh start where his criminal history might remain hidden. Montana, with its small towns and trusting communities, seemed like the perfect place to disappear. He settled in Great Falls in 1991, presenting himself as a reformed man looking for a quiet life. But Nathaniel Barjona had not reformed. He had simply learned to hide better. The first sign that something was amiss came in 1996 when several parents reported that a large man had been following their children home from school. The descriptions varied slightly, but they all pointed to the same individual, a heavy-set man who drove slowly alongside elementary school students, sometimes offering them rides or asking them to help him find his lost puppy. 10-year-old Zachary Ramsey was walking home from Whittier Elementary School on February 6, 1996, when he encountered this man. Unlike the other children who had managed to escape or ignore the stranger's advances, Zachary simply vanished. His mother, Rachel, waited anxiously as the afternoon stretched into evening. When Zachary failed to return home, she contacted the police, setting in motion an investigation that would uncover horrors beyond anyone's imagination. The search for Zachary Ramsey consumed the Great Falls community. Volunteers combed through parks, vacant lots, and wooded areas. Police officers knocked on doors and questioned residents. The local media coverage was extensive, with Zachary's smiling school photograph appearing on television screens and newspaper front pages throughout Montana. Barjona watched this frantic search with keen interest, even volunteering to help distribute missing person flyers. He attended community meetings about child safety and expressed his concern to neighbors about the dangerous individual who might be lurking in their midst. His apparent helpfulness and concern made him seem above suspicion, a concerned citizen rather than the perpetrator everyone was seeking. As weeks turned to months without any trace of Zachary, the investigation began to focus on the reports of the suspicious man who had been approaching children. Police compiled a composite sketch based on witness descriptions, and several people suggested it resembled Nathaniel Barjona. However, when detectives first interviewed him, they found a cooperative man who seemed genuinely concerned about the missing boy. Barjona's ability to manipulate and deceive was remarkable. He had learned to present himself as harmless, even helpful. He spoke knowledgeably about child safety and expressed appropriate emotions when discussing Zachary's disappearance. His apartment appeared normal, even neat and organized. There were no obvious signs of criminal activity, no evidence that would justify a more thorough search. But Barjona had made one crucial mistake. In his eagerness to appear helpful, he had inserted himself too deeply into the investigation. He knew details about Zachary's disappearance that had never been made public. He made offhand comments that suggested intimate knowledge of what had happened to the boy. These inconsistencies caught the attention of Detective Sergeant Al Klein, a veteran investigator who had developed an instinct for recognizing when someone was hiding something. The breakthrough came 18 months after Zachary's disappearance. In August 1997, Barjona attempted to abduct another child, 8-year-old Jared Franks, outside a local grocery store. Unlike his previous victims, Jared fought back and screamed loudly enough to attract attention. Store employees intervened, and Barjona was arrested on the spot. When police searched Barjona's apartment following his arrest, they discovered a collection of items that painted a horrifying picture of his activities. There were children's clothing, toys that didn't belong to him, and photographs of local children taken without their knowledge. More disturbing were the detailed journals Barjona had kept, documenting his fantasies and plans involving children in the community. Among these materials, investigators found items that belonged to Zachary Ramsey, his school backpack, a distinctive jacket, and personal belongings that his mother immediately recognized. The discovery of these items provided the evidence needed to charge Bar-Jonah with Zachary's kidnapping and murder, though the boy's body was never found. The investigation revealed the full scope of Bar-Jonah's activities in Great Falls. He had been systematically stalking children throughout the community for years, learning their routines, identifying vulnerable targets, and planning elaborate schemes to lure them away from safety. His apartment was located strategically near several schools and playgrounds, giving him easy access to observe potential victims. Bar-Jonah's methods were calculating and patient. He would spend weeks studying a particular child, learning their schedule, their route home from school, and their habits. He would then create opportunities to interact with them, slowly building familiarity until the child no longer saw him as a stranger. His size and gentle demeanor helped him appear non-threatening, and he was skilled at gaining the trust of both children and their parents. The trial of Nathaniel Bar-Jonah began in 2002 and revealed disturbing details about his crimes that shocked even seasoned law enforcement professionals. The prosecution presented evidence of Bar-Jonah's elaborate deceptions and the systematic way he had targeted children in the community. Witnesses testified about his suspicious behavior and his inappropriate interest in local children. Perhaps most chilling was the testimony about Bar-Jonah's bizarre behavior following Zachary's disappearance. Neighbors reported that he had hosted several dinner parties in the months after the boy went missing, serving what he claimed were exotic meat dishes. When asked about the unusual taste and texture of the meat, Bar-Jonah would smile mysteriously and say it was his own special recipe. The implication of this testimony was too horrible for many to contemplate, but it suggested that Bar-Jonah's crimes went beyond kidnapping and murder. The defense attempted to portray Bar-Jonah as mentally ill, arguing that his troubled childhood and psychological problems should be considered mitigating factors. They presented evidence of his history of abuse and neglect, suggesting that these experiences had shaped his criminal behavior. However, the prosecution successfully argued that Bar-Jonah's crimes were too calculated and sophisticated to be the result of mental illness alone. Throughout the trial, Bar-Jonah showed little emotion or remorse for his actions. He maintained his innocence despite overwhelming evidence, continuing to insist that he had nothing to do with Zachary's disappearance. His cold demeanor and lack of empathy disturbed everyone who observed him, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that he was a dangerous predator who posed an ongoing threat to the community. The jury deliberated for several days before returning a guilty verdict on multiple charges, including kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. Bar-Jonah was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm a child. The case of Nathaniel Bar-Jonah sent shockwaves through the Great Falls community and beyond. Parents struggled to understand how such a dangerous individual had been able to operate undetected for so long in their midst. The investigation revealed gaps in the system that allowed Bar-Jonah to move from state to state despite his criminal history, highlighting the need for better communication between law enforcement agencies. The impact on the families of Bar-Jonah's victims was devastating and long-lasting. Rachel Ramsey, Zachary's mother, struggled with the loss of her son and the knowledge that his body had never been recovered. She became an advocate for missing children, working to improve the systems designed to protect vulnerable youth and to ensure that predators like Bar-Jonah could not easily escape detection. The case also raised important questions about community safety and the responsibility of neighbors to watch out for one another. Many residents expressed guilt about not recognizing the signs of Bar-Jonah's criminal behavior sooner, wondering if they could have done something to prevent Zachary's disappearance or protect other potential victims. In the years following Bar-Jonah's conviction, additional victims came forward with accounts of suspicious encounters with him. These reports painted a picture of a predator who had been active in the community far longer than anyone had initially realized. The true scope of his crimes may never be fully known, as many potential victims were too young at the time to fully understand what had happened to them. Bar-Jonah's case became a subject of study for criminal profilers and law enforcement professionals seeking to understand how such predators operate and how they can be detected and stopped more quickly. His ability to blend into the community while pursuing his criminal activities highlighted the sophisticated methods used by some serial offenders and the challenges faced by those trying to protect potential victims. The story of Nathaniel Bar Jonah serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. His crimes robbed a family of their beloved child and shattered the sense of safety that small communities often take for granted. But it also demonstrated the power of persistent investigation and the importance of never giving up the search for truth and justice. Today, Zachary Ramsey's case remains officially open, with investigators still hoping that Bar Jonah will eventually reveal the location of the boy's remains. Until that day comes, his family and the Great Falls community continue to seek closure while working to ensure that no other family endures the horror they experienced. The legacy of this case extends beyond the courtroom and the headlines. It serves as a reminder of the vigilance required to protect our most vulnerable citizens and the importance of listening when children report suspicious encounters with adults. In Zachary's memory, his story continues to educate and warn, ensuring that his short life has meaning beyond the tragedy of his death. The kid killer's reign of terror ended with his conviction, but the lessons learned from his crimes continue to resonate, helping communities better protect their children and recognize the signs of predatory behavior before tragedy strikes again. Story 3: The Times Square Ripper. The neon lights of Times Square painted the night in electric blues and reds, casting long shadows between the adult theaters and peep shows that lined the gritty streets of 1970s Manhattan. It was a different world then, darker, more dangerous, where predators could hunt in plain sight among the crowds of tourists, hustlers, and lost souls who gravitated to the crossroads of the world. In this urban jungle, a killer was about to emerge who would terrorize the city and earn one of the most chilling nicknames in criminal history, the Times Square Ripper. So Richard Cottingham seemed an unlikely monster. Born on November 25, 1946 in the Bronx, he grew up in a middle-class family that later moved to the suburbs of New Jersey. To his neighbors and co-workers, he appeared to be the embodiment of 1970s respectability. A computer programmer who commuted daily into Manhattan, a married father of 3 who lived in a modest house in Lodi, New Jersey. He was quiet, well-dressed, and blended seamlessly into the background of suburban American life. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lurked something far more sinister. Cottingham had developed an obsession with the seedy underbelly of New York City, particularly the Times Square area, where sex workers, runaways, and other vulnerable people congregated in the shadows of the bright lights. It was here that he would transform from a mild-mannered computer programmer into one of the most brutal serial killers in New York history. The first confirmed victim of the Times Square Ripper was Nancy Vogel, a 29-year-old woman whose body was discovered in her car in Ridgefield Park, New Jersey, on October 31st, 1977. She had been strangled, and the crime scene bore the hallmarks of what would become Cottingham's signature: extreme violence combined with a disturbing attention to detail that suggested the killer had taken his time with his victim. But it was the murders that followed that would truly shock investigators and earn Cottingham his infamous nickname. On December 2nd, 1979, firefighters responding to a blaze at the Travel Inn Motor Hotel in Times Square made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In room 417, they found the bodies of 2 young women, both decapitated and dismembered with surgical precision. The killer had removed their hands and heads, making identification nearly impossible, and creating a crime scene so horrific that even veteran investigators struggled to process what they were seeing. The women, later identified as Dide Goodarzi and an unidentified victim known only as Jane Doe, had been tortured before their deaths. The level of mutilation was extraordinary, suggesting a killer who not only took pleasure in causing pain, but who had the knowledge and tools necessary to dismember human bodies with clinical efficiency. The hotel room had been set on fire in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence, but the flames had been discovered before they could completely consume the crime scene. This double murder sent shockwaves through New York City. The media seized on the story, dubbing the unknown killer the Times Square Ripper in reference to the brutal mutilations that echoed the crimes of Jack the Ripper nearly a century earlier in London. The nickname stuck, and suddenly every unsolved murder of a young woman in the Times Square area was scrutinized for connections to this new terror. The investigation into the Travel-In murders was massive, involving dozens of detectives and federal agents. The Times Square area was flooded with undercover officers, and every hotel and motel in the vicinity was placed under surveillance. But Cottingham was far too careful to be caught by conventional police work. He had spent years perfecting his methods, learning how to select victims who wouldn't be immediately missed and how to cover his tracks. What investigators didn't realize at the time was that Cottingham had been killing for years before the Travel-In murders brought him to their attention. His victims were primarily sex workers and young women who frequented the Times Square area, people whose disappearances were often not reported or not taken seriously by law enforcement. This allowed him to refine his techniques and develop the confidence that would make him so dangerous. Cottingham's method was chillingly methodical. He would cruise the Times Square area in his car, looking for potential victims. He preferred young women who appeared vulnerable or desperate, particularly those who might be willing to accompany him to a hotel room for money. Once he had isolated a victim, he would reveal his true nature, subjecting them to hours of torture before killing them. The psychological profile developed by FBI experts painted a picture of a highly organized killer who derived sexual pleasure from the complete control and domination of his victims. Unlike disorganized killers who struck randomly and left chaotic crime scenes, Cottingham planned his attacks carefully, brought his own tools, and took steps to avoid detection. This made him far more dangerous and much harder to catch. On May 5, 1980, the investigation took a dramatic turn when Cottingham made his first major mistake. He had lured an 18-year-old woman named Valerie Ann Street to a motel room in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey, where he tortured and killed her. But this time, something went wrong with his usual careful planning. A maid at the motel heard screams coming from the room and called the police. When officers arrived at the Quality Inn, they found Cottingham in the act of attempting to dispose of Street's body. He was covered in blood, and the hotel room was a scene of unimaginable horror. Street had been tortured with a variety of implements before being killed, and Cottingham had begun the process of dismembering her body when the police arrived. The arrest of Richard Cottingham sent shockwaves through the suburban community where he lived. His neighbors couldn't believe that the quiet computer programmer who lived down the street was the monster who had been terrorizing New York City. His wife and children were devastated, struggling to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the killer described in the newspapers. The investigation into Cottingham's background revealed a pattern of escalating violence that had been hidden beneath his respectable exterior. Detectives discovered that he had been arrested multiple times for soliciting prostitutes and had a history of violent behavior toward women that dated back years. But somehow these warning signs had never been connected to form a complete picture of the danger he represented. As investigators delved deeper into Cottingham's activities, they began linking him to a series of unsolved murders and disappearances throughout the New York metropolitan area. The evidence was overwhelming: hotel receipts, witness identifications, and physical evidence that placed him at multiple crime scenes. It became clear that the Times Square Ripper had been far more active than anyone had initially suspected. The trial of Richard Cottingham began in 1981, and the evidence presented painted a picture of a man who had lived a double life for years. By day, he was a respected computer programmer who worked for a healthcare company in Manhattan. By night, he prowled the streets of Times Square, looking for victims to satisfy his violent fantasies. Prosecutors argued that Cottingham was a sexual sadist who derived pleasure from the complete domination and destruction of his victims. The evidence they presented was overwhelming and deeply disturbing. Crime scene photographs showed the extent of the mutilations he had inflicted, while hotel records placed him at the scene of multiple murders. The defense team faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against Cottingham was extensive and convincing, linking him to multiple crime scenes through physical evidence, witness testimony, and his own admissions. They attempted to argue that he was mentally ill and not responsible for his actions, but the organized nature of his crimes suggested otherwise. During the trial, investigators revealed the full scope of Cottingham's crimes. He was directly linked to at least 11 murders, though detectives suspected the actual number was much higher. His victims ranged in age from teenagers to women in their 30s, and they had all been subjected to extreme violence before their deaths. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was Cottingham's apparent ability to compartmentalize his crimes. His co-workers described him as a competent and reliable employee who never displayed any signs of the violence he was capable of. His family knew him as a husband and father who seemed devoted to his children. This Jekyll and Hyde personality made him particularly dangerous, as no one suspected the horror he was capable of inflicting. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Cottingham guilty on all counts. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against him. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another person. But even after his conviction, the Times Square Ripper case continued to evolve. In the years following his imprisonment, Cottingham began making additional confessions to crimes that had never been solved. He claimed responsibility for murders dating back to the 1960s, including cases that had long been considered cold. These confessions created both hope and frustration for investigators. While they provided potential closure for families who had been waiting decades for answers, they also raised questions about which admissions were truthful and which might be fabricated. Cottingham seemed to enjoy the attention his confessions brought, and investigators had to carefully verify each claim against existing evidence. One of the most significant developments came in 2010 when Cottingham confessed to the 1974 murder of Lorraine Marie Kelly, a case that had remained unsolved for over 35 years. The confession was backed up by details that only the killer could have known, providing closure to Kelly's family after decades of uncertainty. In recent years, Cottingham has continued to provide information about unsolved cases, working with investigators to identify additional victims and provide details about crimes that occurred decades ago. This cooperation has been motivated partly by his desire for better treatment in prison and partly by what appears to be a genuine recognition of the pain his crimes have caused. The Times Square Ripper case had a profound impact on law enforcement practices and public awareness of serial crime. It highlighted the vulnerability of sex workers and other marginalized populations, who became Cottingham's preferred victims. The case also demonstrated the importance of interagency cooperation, as Cottingham's crimes spanned multiple jurisdictions in New York and New Jersey. The investigation revealed significant gaps in how law enforcement agencies communicated with each other and tracked similar crimes across jurisdictional boundaries. These lessons led to improvements in information sharing and the development of better systems for identifying patterns in violent crime. The case also brought attention to the dangers faced by women working in the sex trade, particularly in areas like Times Square, where they were vulnerable to predators like Cottingham. Advocacy groups used the case to highlight the need for better protection and support services for sex workers, arguing that treating them as criminals rather than potential victims made them more vulnerable to violence. The transformation of Times Square since the 1970s and 1980s has been dramatic. The seedy adult theaters and peep shows where Cottingham hunted his victims have been replaced by family-friendly attractions and corporate chain stores. But the memory of the Times Square Ripper serves as a reminder of the dark period when the area was synonymous with danger and exploitation. For the families of Cottingham's victims, his imprisonment brought some measure of justice, but the pain of their losses never fully healed. Many struggled with questions about why their loved ones had become targets and whether their deaths could have been prevented if warning signs had been recognized earlier. The psychological impact of Cottingham's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims to include their families, the investigators who worked the case, and the broader community that lived in fear during his killing spree. The brutality of his crimes and the calculated nature of his attacks challenged people's assumptions about safety and human nature. Today, Richard Cottingham remains imprisoned in New Jersey, where he continues to serve multiple life sentences. Now in his 70s, he has spent more than 4 decades behind bars, longer than many of his victims lived. His case continues to be studied by criminologists and law enforcement professionals as an example of how organized serial killers can evade detection for years while hiding in plain sight. The legacy of the Times Square Ripper case serves as both a chronicle of evil and a testament to the persistence of investigators who refuse to give up on solving these horrific crimes. It reminds us that monsters can lurk behind the most ordinary facades and that vigilance is the price of safety in any community. The story of Richard Cottingham and the Times Square Ripper murders stands as one of the most disturbing chapters in New York City's criminal history, a reminder of a darker time when the bright lights of Times Square cast shadows that concealed unimaginable horrors. Story 4, The Giggling Granny. The year was 1953, and the small town of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was about to become the backdrop for one of the most chilling and bizarre murder cases in American history. It began with what seemed like an unfortunate accident, but would eventually unravel into a web of poison, insurance money, and a grandmother whose unsettling laughter would haunt investigators for decades to come. Nanny Doss appeared to be the epitome of a sweet Southern grandmother. At 58 years old, she had graying hair that she kept neatly pinned back, wore simple house dresses with small floral patterns, and always seemed to have a warm smile on her face. Neighbors knew her as someone who baked the best apple pies in the county and could often be seen tending to her garden, humming old hymns while she worked among the tomatoes and roses. But there was something else about Nanny Doss that people remembered: her laugh. It wasn't the warm, comforting chuckle you might expect from a grandmother. Instead, it was a high-pitched, almost musical giggle that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep inside her at the most unexpected moments. Even when discussing serious matters, even when talking about death and tragedy, that distinctive giggle would escape her lips, creating an unsettling contrast that made people shift uncomfortably in their presence. The case that would eventually expose Nanny Doss began on October 12, 1954, when her fifth husband, Samuel Doss, collapsed in their modest home on East Pine Street. Samuel had been complaining of stomach pains for several days, describing a burning sensation that seemed to get worse after every meal. Nanny had been caring for him dutifully, bringing him homemade soup and ensuring he took his medicine. She called the doctor when Samuel's condition worsened, her voice filled with what sounded like genuine concern. Dr. Harrison arrived to find Samuel writhing in agony, his face pale and covered in sweat. Despite the doctor's efforts, Samuel Doss died that evening, his body racked with convulsions. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, which wasn't uncommon for a man of Samuel's age and health history. Nanny played the role of the grieving widow perfectly, weeping at the funeral and accepting condolences from neighbors who brought casseroles and flowers. But something nagged at Dr. Harrison. Samuel's symptoms didn't quite match typical heart failure, and there was something about Nanny's demeanor that he couldn't shake. During one of their conversations about Samuel's final days, when she was describing his suffering, that strange giggle had bubbled up from her throat. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to plant a seed of suspicion in the doctor's mind. Dr. Harrison made a decision that would change everything. Despite the family's wishes to proceed with burial quickly, he convinced the authorities to order an autopsy. The results were shocking. Samuel Doss's body contained enough arsenic to kill several men. This wasn't a case of accidental poisoning or heart failure. This was murder. When confronted with the evidence, Nanny Doss didn't deny it. In fact, she seemed almost relieved to finally talk about it. Sitting in the police station's interrogation room, she began to tell a story that would horrify even seasoned investigators. As she spoke, that unsettling giggle punctuated her confessions, creating an atmosphere that was both surreal and deeply disturbing. Samuel wasn't the first, she said, her eyes bright with an emotion that investigators couldn't quite identify. He was just the last one I got tired of. The giggle came again, soft but unmistakable. What unfolded over the next several hours was the confession of a serial killer who had been operating for decades, hiding behind the facade of a loving wife and mother. Nanny Doss, who would later be dubbed the Giggling Granny by the press, admitted to murdering 4 of her 5 husbands, 2 of her children, her mother, her mother-in-law, her nephew, and a grandson. Her first husband, Charlie Braggs, had died in 1945 under what were then considered natural circumstances. Looking back, investigators realized that his symptoms had been remarkably similar to Samuel's. Her second husband, Frank Harrelson, had died of what was believed to be food poisoning in 1945. The third, Arlie Lanning, succumbed to what doctors had diagnosed as heart problems in 1947. Her fourth husband, Richard Morton, had died of what appeared to be complications from his previous illnesses in 1953. Each death had been carefully spaced apart. Each had seemed plausible at the time, and each had resulted in insurance payouts that allowed Nanny to maintain her lifestyle and eventually move on to find another husband. She had a pattern, investigators realized. She would meet men through Lonely Hearts columns in romance magazines, corresponding with them for months before meeting in person. She presented herself as a devoted Christian woman looking for companionship in her golden years. But the husbands weren't her only victims. Her confession revealed a trail of family members who had died under suspicious circumstances, spanning back to the 1920s. Her two middle daughters, Melvina and Florine, had died as infants, both supposedly from food poisoning. Her mother, Lou Hazel, had died while visiting Nanny in 1953, officially from stomach problems. Her mother-in-law, Arlie Lanning's mother, had died shortly after moving in with them. The most chilling aspect of Nanny's confession wasn't just the number of victims, but her reasoning. She didn't kill for money alone, though the insurance payments were certainly a factor. She killed, she explained with that characteristic giggle, because people disappointed her. They weren't romantic enough, or they were too demanding, or they got in the way of her reading her beloved romance magazines. I was looking for the perfect mate, she told investigators, her voice taking on an almost dreamy quality. Someone who would be sweet and romantic, like in the stories I read, but they always turned out to be such disappointments. The giggle came again, longer this time, as if she found the whole situation genuinely amusing. Her method was always the same: arsenic, administered gradually in food or drink. She had learned about the poison years earlier, possibly from reading about rat control in farming magazines. The symptoms could easily be mistaken for various illnesses, especially in an era before sophisticated toxicology testing was routine. She was patient, sometimes taking weeks to administer fatal doses, which made the deaths appear even more natural. The investigation expanded as authorities began exhuming bodies across multiple states. Each exhumation confirmed what investigators now suspected: Nanny Doss had been poisoning people for over 30 years. The scope of her crimes was staggering, and the fact that she had operated undetected for so long spoke to both her cunning and the limitations of forensic science at the time. During her trial, Nanny became something of a media sensation. Reporters were fascinated by the contrast between her grandmotherly appearance and the horrific nature of her crimes. She would sit in the courtroom, often knitting or reading romance magazines, occasionally letting out that distinctive giggle when testimony described her victim's suffering or her own methods. The press dubbed her the Giggling Granny, the Lonely Hearts Killer, and the Black Widow. Photos of her in the courtroom showed a woman who seemed almost oblivious to the gravity of the situation, sometimes smiling at cameras as if she were posing for a church directory rather than sitting trial for multiple murders. Psychiatrists who examined Nanny struggled to understand her psychology. She didn't fit the typical profile of a serial killer as understood at the time. She wasn't obviously insane, nor did she seem to be driven by the kind of sexual or power motivations that characterized many serial killers. Instead, she appeared to be motivated by a combination of greed, convenience, and a deeply narcissistic worldview that allowed her to eliminate anyone who interfered with her fantasy of finding perfect romantic love. Her giggle, which had so unsettled those who knew her, became the subject of particular interest. Some psychiatrists theorized that it was a nervous response, a way of dealing with stress or guilt. Others believed it reflected a genuine lack of empathy, an inability to recognize the seriousness of death and suffering. Whatever its origin, the giggle became her most memorable characteristic, the detail that stuck with everyone who encountered her. The trial revealed disturbing details about how Nanny had convinced herself that her actions were justified. She spoke about her victims as if they were characters in a story that simply needed to be edited out when they became inconvenient. She showed no remorse for the children she had killed, referring to them as burdens who prevented her from finding happiness. Her lack of emotional connection to her crimes was perhaps more chilling than any display of obvious madness would have been. In 1955, Nanny Doss was sentenced to life in prison. The death penalty was considered, but her age and gender worked in her favor during an era when executing women was extremely rare. She was sent to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, where she would spend the rest of her life. Even in prison, Nanny maintained her distinctive personality. Guards reported that she was generally well-behaved and popular among other inmates, who were drawn to her grandmotherly demeanor and her willingness to share stories and advice. She became known for her skill at crocheting and her extensive collection of romance magazines, which she read voraciously and shared with others. But the giggle never went away. Prison staff and fellow inmates reported that even decades after her conviction, Nanny would occasionally let out that unsettling laugh at inappropriate moments. When discussing her crimes with psychiatrists, when describing her victims, or even when talking about seemingly innocent topics, the giggle would emerge, a reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath her pleasant exterior. The case of Nanny Doss challenged many assumptions about serial killers and female criminals. At a time when violent crime was largely seen as a male phenomenon, her case demonstrated that women could be just as calculating and ruthless as any male killer. Her ability to maintain a facade of normalcy for decades, to be seen as a pillar of her community while systematically murdering family members, highlighted how easily evil could hide in plain sight. Investigators who worked on the case later reflected on how many clues they had missed over the years. Multiple family members dying of similar symptoms, the pattern of insurance payouts, even the reports from neighbors about Nanny's strange reactions to tragedy. All of these warning signs had been there, but the social context of the time had made them easy to dismiss or overlook. The giggling granny case also highlighted the limitations of forensic science in the 1940s and early 1950s. Without routine toxicology testing, without comprehensive databases to track patterns of suspicious deaths, and without the communication networks that exist today, serial killers like Nanny Doss could operate with relative impunity for extended periods. Nanny Doss died in prison in 1965, having served 10 years of her life sentence. Even in her final days, nurses reported that she maintained her cheerful demeanor, chatting with visitors and continuing to read her romance magazines. When she passed away, it was from leukemia, a natural death that stood in stark contrast to the unnatural deaths she had inflicted on so many others. The legacy of the giggling granny case extends far beyond the individual crimes she committed. Her case helped shape modern understanding of female serial killers and contributed to changes in how suspicious deaths are investigated. It demonstrated the importance of toxicology testing and the need for better communication between jurisdictions when patterns of unexplained deaths emerge. But perhaps most importantly, the case serves as a reminder that evil rarely looks the way we expect it to. Nanny Doss looked like everyone's ideal grandmother, the kind of woman you would trust to babysit your children or bake cookies for a church social. Her ability to maintain this facade while committing horrific crimes over decades is a testament to the complexity of human nature and the dangers of making assumptions based on appearances. The sound of her giggle, that high-pitched musical laugh that so unsettled those who knew her, became a symbol of how something seemingly innocent could mask something deeply sinister. It reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who appear the most harmless, those who know exactly how to blend into the fabric of ordinary life while pursuing their dark purposes. Today, the case of Nanny Doss continues to fascinate criminologists, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts. Her story has been featured in countless books, documentaries, and television programs, each trying to understand how a grandmother from Oklahoma became one of America's most prolific serial killers. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of her story isn't the number of people she killed or even the methods she used. It's that distinctive giggle, echoing through the decades as a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary evil. Story 5, Jolly Jane. In the gaslight era of Victorian America, when medicine was more art than science and death was a frequent visitor to every household, there lived a nurse whose very presence brought comfort to the dying. Her name was Jane Toppin, but everyone knew her simply as Jolly Jane. With her warm smile, gentle hands, and cheerful disposition, she seemed like an angel of mercy sent to ease the suffering of those in their final hours. Patients would light up when she entered their rooms, and families trusted her completely with their most vulnerable loved ones. But behind that jovial exterior lurked something far more sinister. Jane Toppin would eventually confess to killing 31 people, though investigators suspected the true number was much higher. She didn't kill for money, revenge, or even mercy. Instead, she killed for something far more disturbing: the intimate thrill of watching life drain from her victims' eyes while they trusted her completely. The story of Jolly Jane begins in the most tragic of circumstances. Born Honora Kelly in 1857, she entered the world in the Irish immigrant slums of Boston, where poverty and desperation were constant companions. Her mother died of tuberculosis when Jane was just a toddler, leaving her father, Peter Kelly, to raise 8 children alone. Peter was an alcoholic who struggled with mental illness, and the family lived in squalor that shocked even their impoverished neighbors. When Jane was 6 years old, her father made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. Unable to care for his children and teetering on the edge of complete mental collapse, he took Jane and her sister to the Boston Female Asylum, a charitable institution for destitute children. The act of abandonment was devastating to young Jane, who clung to her father's legs as he tried to leave, begging him not to abandon her. The asylum was a harsh place, run with strict discipline and little warmth. Children were expected to be grateful for the basic necessities of life and to work for their keep from an early age. Jane, however, seemed to adapt with remarkable resilience. She developed a bright, cheerful personality that endeared her to the staff and other children. She learned to be helpful, always volunteering for extra duties, always ready with a smile or a joke to lighten the mood. But even then, there were signs that something wasn't quite right with Jane. Other children reported that she would sometimes hurt small animals and then comfort them as they died, seeming to take pleasure in both the infliction of pain and the act of providing solace. She also showed an unusual fascination with death, often volunteering to help prepare the bodies of children who died at the asylum, a task that most found deeply disturbing. When Jane was 18, she was placed as a servant with the Toppin family in Lowell, Massachusetts. The Toppins were a middle-class family who treated Jane more like an adopted daughter than a servant. They gave her their name, provided her with education, and showed her the kind of stable family life she had never known. Under their care, Jane blossomed into an intelligent, articulate young woman with dreams of making something of herself. It was during her time with the Toppins that Jane first became interested in nursing. The profession was just beginning to gain respectability, moving away from its association with untrained women of questionable character toward a more scientific and professional approach to patient care. Jane was drawn to the idea of having a respectable career that would also allow her to help people in their times of greatest need. In 1885, at the age of 28, Jane enrolled in the nursing program at Cambridge Hospital. She proved to be an exceptional student, quickly mastering the technical aspects of patient care and demonstrating an unusual ability to connect with patients. Her instructors praised her dedication and her natural bedside manner. Patients consistently requested her specifically, saying that her presence made them feel better, even when their medical conditions hadn't improved. But Jane's fellow nursing students began to notice something troubling. While she was indeed popular with patients, there seemed to be an unusually high number of unexpected deaths among those under her care. Patients who had been recovering well would suddenly take a turn for the worse during Jane's shifts. The deaths weren't necessarily suspicious individually. Sick people died in hospitals, after all, but the pattern was beginning to become noticeable to those who worked closely with her. Jane herself seemed remarkably unaffected by these deaths. While other nurses would be visibly shaken by losing a patient, Jane would maintain her cheerful demeanor, often making lighthearted comments about the deceased or quickly moving on to care for other patients. Some colleagues found this professionalism admirable, while others found it unsettling. After completing her training, Jane worked at several hospitals in the Boston area, always earning praise from supervisors for her technical skills and patient rapport. She had a particular talent for caring for elderly patients and those with terminal illnesses, populations that other nurses sometimes found depressing or difficult to work with. Jane seemed to genuinely enjoy spending time with these patients, often staying after her shifts to sit with them and provide comfort. It was during this period that Jane began to develop her methodology. She discovered that certain combinations of medications, particularly opiates and stimulants, could be administered in ways that would cause dramatic but seemingly natural changes in a patient's condition. She learned to read the subtle signs of drug interactions and how to manipulate dosages to achieve specific effects. Most importantly, she learned how to do all of this while maintaining the appearance of providing exceptional patient care. Jane's preferred method involved the use of morphine and atropine, drugs that were commonly available in hospitals and often prescribed for patients in pain. When combined in certain proportions, these substances could cause a range of symptoms that could mimic various medical conditions. A patient might appear to be suffering from heart problems, respiratory distress, or neurological complications, when in reality they were experiencing carefully orchestrated drug poisoning. But Jane didn't simply kill randomly. She was selective about her victims, choosing patients who were already seriously ill or elderly, making their deaths appear natural and expected. She also seemed to prefer patients who were alone or had limited family support, reducing the likelihood that anyone would question the circumstances of their death or demand a thorough investigation. What made Jane's crimes particularly chilling was the personal nature of her interactions with her victims. She would spend hours with patients in their final moments, holding their hands, speaking softly to them, and providing what appeared to be genuine comfort and compassion. Many victims died believing that Jane was an angel sent to ease their suffering, never realizing that she was actually the cause of their distress. In 1889, Jane left hospital work to become a private nurse, a decision that would give her even greater access to vulnerable victims and less oversight of her activities. Private nursing was a growing field, as wealthy families preferred to have their loved ones cared for at home rather than in the often unsanitary conditions of public hospitals. Jane's reputation for excellent patient care made her highly sought after, and she was able to command premium rates for her services. Working in private homes gave Jane unprecedented access to her victims and their families. She would move into households, sometimes for weeks or months at a time, becoming an integral part of the family dynamic. She was often present for intimate family moments, privy to personal secrets and financial information, and trusted with the most precious responsibility, the care of beloved family members. The Davis family of Catamount, Massachusetts, would become Jane's most infamous victims, though their deaths wouldn't be recognized as murders until years later. In 1899, Jane was hired to care for Mattie Davis, an elderly woman suffering from a chronic illness. Jane quickly endeared herself to the entire Davis family, becoming not just a nurse, but a trusted friend and confidant. Over the course of several weeks, Jane's care seemed to work miracles. Mattie's condition would improve dramatically, giving the family hope that she might recover completely. But then she would suffer sudden relapses, becoming violently ill with symptoms that puzzled the local doctor. During these episodes, Jane would be constantly at Mattie's side, administering medications and providing round-the-clock care. The pattern continued for months, periods of improvement followed by sudden severe relapses. Each time, Jane's dedicated nursing seemed to be the only thing standing between Mattie and death. The family became completely dependent on Jane, treating her like a member of the family and trusting her judgment completely. Eventually, despite Jane's apparent best efforts, Mattie Davis died. The family was grief-stricken but deeply grateful to Jane for the comfort she had provided during Mattie's final months. They invited her to stay on to help care for other family members, and Jane readily agreed. Over the next several months, death seemed to follow Jane through the Davis household. Mattie's husband Alden became ill and died under Jane's care. Their daughter Genevieve, who had been in perfect health, suddenly developed mysterious symptoms and died within days. The family's close friend, Irving Gibbs, who had come to help with funeral arrangements, also became ill and died while Jane was caring for him. By the time the wave of deaths in the Davis family was complete, 4 people had died in a matter of months, all while under the care of the same nurse. Yet such was Jane's skill at manipulation and her reputation for exceptional care that no one initially suspected anything sinister. The deaths were attributed to a variety of natural causes, and Jane was praised for her dedication in staying with the family through such a difficult time. But the pattern of deaths following Jane from household to household was becoming harder to ignore. Other nursing colleagues began to whisper about the unusual number of patients who died under her care. Doctors started to notice that patients who had been stable would suddenly deteriorate when Jane was on duty. Family members began to compare notes and realize that Jane had been present for an alarming number of deaths among their social circle. The investigation that would finally expose Jane began in 1901, when Alden Davis's surviving relatives became suspicious about the rapid succession of deaths in their family. They hired a private detective to look into the circumstances, and what he discovered was deeply disturbing. Not only had an unusual number of people died while under Jane's care, but there were also financial irregularities surrounding many of these deaths. Jane had a habit of ingratiating herself with patients and their families to the point where they would often leave her money or valuable items in their wills. She had also been forging prescriptions to obtain large quantities of drugs, far more than would be needed for legitimate patient care. Most damning of all, when authorities began to exhume the bodies of some of Jane's former patients, they found evidence of drug poisoning in case after case. When Jane was finally arrested in October 1901, she initially denied all charges, maintaining her innocence with the same cheerful demeanor that had made her so popular with patients. She insisted that she had always done her best to save her patients, and that the deaths had all been from natural causes. Her supporters, and there were many, found it difficult to believe that the kind, caring nurse they knew could be capable of such horrible crimes. But as the evidence mounted and the investigation expanded, Jane's facade began to crack. Under intense questioning, she finally broke down and confessed, but not in the way investigators expected. Rather than showing remorse or shame, Jane seemed almost relieved to finally be able to talk about what she had done. She described her crimes in clinical detail, explaining her methods and motivations with a matter-of-fact tone that chilled everyone who heard her. What was most disturbing about Jane's confession was her explanation of why she killed. She didn't claim to be putting patients out of their misery or helping them avoid suffering. Instead, she admitted that she killed for the intense emotional experience it provided her. She described feeling a sexual thrill from watching her victims die, particularly from being so intimately close to them during their final moments when they trusted her completely. "I held them in my arms and watched them draw their last breath," she told investigators. "They looked into my eyes with such trust, such gratitude, even as I was killing them. It was the most intimate experience I've ever had with another human being." Jane's confession revealed the depths of her psychological disturbance. She admitted to experimenting with different drug combinations to see how they affected her victims, sometimes reviving patients who were near death just so she could kill them again more slowly. She described feeling powerful and godlike, having complete control over life and death in a way that gave her a sense of purpose and excitement that nothing else in her life had ever provided. The trial of Jane Toppin became a media sensation, with newspapers across the country covering every detail of the proceedings. The public was fascinated and horrified by the revelation that a trusted healthcare provider could have used her position to commit such heinous crimes. The case challenged fundamental assumptions about the nursing profession and raised questions about how society could protect vulnerable patients from those who would exploit their trust. Jane's defense team attempted to argue that she was insane, pointing to her traumatic childhood and the history of mental illness in her family. They brought in psychiatrists who testified that her behavior was consistent with various forms of mental disease and that she couldn't be held fully responsible for her actions. But the prosecution argued that Jane's crimes showed clear evidence of planning and premeditation. They pointed to her careful selection of victims, her methodical approach to poisoning, and her ability to maintain her facade of caring professionalism for years as evidence that she knew exactly what she was doing and understood that it was wrong. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. Jane was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Taunton State Hospital, where she would spend the rest of her days in the criminal ward for the criminally insane. Even in the mental hospital, Jane maintained many of the personality traits that had made her so effective as a nurse and so dangerous as a killer. She was popular with both staff and other patients, always ready with a joke or a kind word. She seemed to genuinely enjoy helping care for other patients in the hospital, though she was never allowed to administer medications or have unsupervised access to anyone who might be vulnerable. Jane lived in the hospital for nearly 50 years, becoming something of an institution herself. She gave interviews to psychiatrists and researchers who were trying to understand the psychology of serial killers, and she seemed to enjoy the attention these sessions brought her. She never expressed remorse for her crimes, instead maintaining that she had provided a service to her victims by giving them peaceful deaths. Over the years, Jane's case became a subject of study for criminologists and psychologists trying to understand what drives someone to kill. Her crimes predated much of the modern understanding of serial killer psychology, but her case provided valuable insights into the minds of those who kill for psychological gratification rather than material gain. What made Jane particularly dangerous was her ability to exploit the trust inherent in the caregiver-patient relationship. Patients and families naturally trusted nurses with their most intimate and vulnerable moments, never imagining that this trust could be used as a weapon against them. Jane's crimes highlighted the need for better oversight and accountability in healthcare settings, leading to reforms in how hospitals and private nursing services monitored their employees. The case also raised disturbing questions about how many other healthcare providers might have committed similar crimes without being detected. Jane's success in avoiding suspicion for so many years suggested that the healthcare system of her era was poorly equipped to identify patterns of suspicious deaths or investigate potential medical murders. Jane Toppin died in the Taunton State Hospital in 1938 at the age of 81. Even in her final years, she maintained her cheerful demeanor and her complete lack of remorse for her crimes. When asked by a psychiatrist if she had any regrets about her life, she reportedly replied that her only regret was that she hadn't been able to kill more people. Her death marked the end of one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history, but her legacy lived on in the changes her case brought to the healthcare system and in the ongoing study of serial killer psychology. The case of Jolly Jane Toppin demonstrated that evil could hide behind the most trusted and caring facade, and that society's most vulnerable members needed protection not just from obvious threats, but from those who would exploit their trust and dependency. Today, Jane Toppin is remembered as one of America's first recognized female serial killers and one of the most prolific medical murderers in history. Her case continues to be studied by criminologists, healthcare administrators, and anyone interested in understanding how trusted professionals can betray the fundamental principles of their calling. The story of Jolly Jane serves as a reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that trust, while necessary for society to function, must be balanced with appropriate safeguards and oversight. Her victims, who died believing they were in the hands of a caring angel of mercy, instead fell prey to someone whose capacity for evil was matched only by her ability to hide it behind a mask of professional competence and personal charm. In the end, Jane Toppin's true legacy may be the awareness her crimes brought to the potential for abuse within positions of trust and the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members from those who would exploit their weakness for personal gratification. Her story stands as a dark chapter in the history of American crime, but also as a catalyst for positive changes in how we approach patient safety and professional accountability in healthcare settings. And so we close another chapter in the shadows of true crime. If you're still listening, thank you for joining me on this journey into the darkness. The story of the giggling granny reminds us that truth can be stranger and more unsettling than fiction, hidden behind the most innocent of faces. Rest easy knowing that justice was served and that these stories from the past help us better understand the complexities of human nature. Sweet dreams, and remember, even in the darkest tales, there's always a light that eventually exposes the truth. Until next time, sleep well.